Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the second in a line of videos on Nahida's teams. Now, I want to take a look at Anemo Hyperbloom stuff, which have been dubbed Salad because there were teams before Dendro came out that people called Soup. It's teams that use Pyro, Electro, Anemo, and Hydro, and you're triggering overloads, vapes, swirls, electro charges, and a bunch of chain reactions with your swirl. And so you end up doing stuff like, very cool. Alright, and you can see there's quite a few numbers on screen. So people called it soup because it was like you're just putting a lot of ingredients in your soup and you're mixing it together. And so when Dendro came out and we had different ways of doing quote-unquote reaction soups in order to differentiate the kind of reaction soups we're doing, we started calling it different names. And so the one with Hyperbloom plus Anemo, so when you have an Anemo unit, an Electro unit, a Dendro unit, and a Hydro unit, it's salad because instead of the heat that you applied to the soup, you put some more vegetables in, right? So it's salad. Salad is one of the teams where Nahida isn't actually that big of an increase over Dendro main character. I think it's definitely one of her good teams still, one of her better teams even, because Salad as a baseline is very, very good. But it also happens to be a team where if you don't have Nahida, you can still use Dendro main character and get very solid results out of them. The baseline like archetype is basically just putting an Anemo unit in your Hyperbloom team. But if you do that, your Anemo unit can swirl. And if you swirl Electro, your Anemo unit can trigger the Hyperblooms because Electro Swirl can hit the seeds and you're hitting them with Electro, so you trigger Hyperbloom. The thing is, if you do that, then you don't need to have an Electro unit that hits the seed. You don't need to be using someone like Kuki or Raiden or Yai or whatever who can reliably hit the seeds because you can just have your Anemo unit do that. And because you want to build your Anemo unit full EM anyways just for the swirl damage, then they already have enough EM to make those Hyperblooms worth using. And so what you can do is you can use Electro units that you don't build with EM and you try to have them not trigger the seeds. The best two units for that are generally going to be Fischl and Beidou because Beidou's burst has the property that it will never hit the seeds at all. Like your cast for your burst and your elemental skill can trigger the seeds, but the bounces that you get after you've used your burst will not hit the seeds at all. And so you can make sure that it's always going to be your Anemo unit that gets the triggers, and therefore you can build your Electro unit with attack, damage, and crit, which if they were triggering the reactions, if they were triggering Hyperblooms, you wouldn't really want to do. You can also use Fischl, who will unfortunately hit some of the Hyperbloom seeds, but she won't hit all of them. Part of why she can end up hitting a decent-ish amount of seeds is because you're triggering her Ascension 4, which makes lightning fall down from the sky and deal electro damage, and that can hit the seeds with an okay amount of reliability. But in order to trigger the Ascension 4, you have to trigger an electro reaction with your on-field character, and your on-field character is an Anemo unit, then you've already electro swirled, so it's fine if your A4 hits the seeds because there's no seeds. So, while Fischl can steal some seeds with Oz's attacks, she won't steal too many. And unlike Beidou, she has a lot better electro application onto the enemies, which means that it's easier if you're in single target to keep the enemies with an electro aura, because if you don't have an electro aura, you can't swirl, right? In order to swirl, you have to apply Anemo on electro. If the enemy doesn't have an electro aura, you can't do that. And that's part of the reason why Nahida isn't like always a big increase over Dendro main character in Salad teams, is because since she applies more Dendro, it can make it more difficult to have an underlying electro aura for your Anemo character to trigger an electro swirl. So one of the nice things about this is one of the very few teams that can actually use the AoE of Hyperbloom. So Hyperbloom doesn't have a very large AoE, but it does have one. It does have a very, very small AoE. But usually you're not going to actually be able to take advantage of it because the enemies aren't close enough. But when you're playing Salad teams, you have an Anemo unit, which means you have a grouper, which means that you can actually have the enemies be close enough to take the AoE damage from Hyperbloom. Anyways, all that out of the way, let's show the team in action. You can see, right? The team does pretty well. Now, to support what I said earlier about Nahida not always being better than Dendro main character, I'll show the same thing with Dendro main character. But yeah, the main difference here is that Dendro main character only applies 1 unit of Dendro instead of 1.5 units. which means that it's actually a lot easier to maintain your auras properly. But yeah, and another one of the possible downsides is if you don't have Constellation 6 on Fischl, especially with Nahida, it can be very, very, very difficult to actually make sure you have enough Electro to get your Electro swirls. We can also show it in single target. Kill him, but you can see in the top of the screen, you can see the aura, and you can see that we're maintaining an Electro aura relatively consistently. It's not always there, but it's there enough to get consistent Hyperblooms. When you're in AoE, Beidou actually has pretty good Electro application as well. Her Electro application is really bad in single target because her burst can't bounce, and so her ICD doesn't like work the same way. But when you're in AoE, her Electro application is actually quite good. That's a lot better. You get the idea, right? One of the main upsides to this is that you end up getting very, very, very good versatility. You don't really have any content that you can't do well. With a team like this, it's a team that has good grouping, but also has very good single target damage and good AoE damage. It can kind of just do everything, which is nice. I'm personally more of a fan of the version with Fischl than the version with Beidou, because obviously the Beidou version in single target isn't very good. And honestly, I think I prefer the version with Dendro main character than the version with Nahida as well. But that's not to say that it's bad, right? It's still very good. For Hydro, you can use any sort of off-field Hydro, including someone like Kokomi. Although obviously if you end up using Kokomi, you're not going to get as many seeds generated. You might be able to do some Quick Bloom stuff where you maintain your Quicken Aura though. So there's upsides and downsides. They're both good. You can also use off-field Ayato. You can use Yelan, but yeah. And then for your Anemo, you can use Kazuha. You can use Venti too, but Venti's Anemo is like, it's not consistent, so meh. I personally like Sucrose the most because she has good grouping while on field, on top of also having Anemo normal attacks, and she's the only one to have that, right? Either you have Anemo normal attacks, Heizo Xiao, or you have good grouping Kazuha. Sucrose is the only one that does both, so I like her a lot on those teams, but she's definitely not the only good option. And to show that, I'm gonna be doing Salad on both sides. Can you eat, please? Oh my god. But you can also see how if it doesn't, enemies just kind of die. Now here, unfortunately, we're back in single target with Beidou, which means that her application is kind of shit. Okay, there we go. How did I not? Whatever, it's fine. This one's a little bit more sussy right now, but it's fine. Okay, fuck you. Now, obviously, this is not the best results because I'm kind of separating the good stuff between two different teams to make two good ones. When it comes to your Anemo unit, you don't actually have that many options because Nahida's 1.5 units of Electro basically make it so that if it triggers from an Electro Charge or a Bloom instead of from an Electro Swirl, you're gonna remove your Electro. And that sucks. When you don't end up using your Hydro, right? You're never gonna lose your Electro, basically, ever, as long as you stay in AoE. Once you get to single target, you can start losing it. The reason why that's happening is because when you trigger your Electro Swirl, you're gonna remove the Electro from the enemy and swirl it onto nearby enemies. If they have Electro on them, you'll be fine because your Nahida E is gonna hit those enemies before the swirl does, and then the swirl will hit them. And so your Nahida E is gonna trigger Quicken and remove the underlying Electro, but then the swirl will reapply underlying Electro. But if those enemies do not have Electro on them, then it won't apply an underlying Electro, and you're gonna lose your Electro from the enemy that had it, and you're not gonna gain it on the enemy that didn't. Okay, so one of them has underlying Electro, the other ones don't. So if I do this, I lose my Electro. Right? So effectively, it can be pretty difficult to maintain your Electro, even in AoE, if you ever end up in a situation like that, which can actually happen if the enemies are grouped well together. And so, when choosing your Anemo unit for your salad team, you will generally be a lot better off using units that are good at grouping enemies. Or, you can give up on Electro Swirls and go for a unit that can infuse with Electro. So something like Sayu, for example, can work. So you can do that. And it works. It's not the greatest, but it works. Oh no. We fucked up a little bit. That's fine. Oh, it's so funny. Point being, when things go right, it's actually a pretty okay team, funnily enough. It's a frustrating team though, because shit never goes right and I hate it, but it's fine. That's kind of it for the Salad stuff. Like I said, I do consider DMC to actually, honestly, generally be better in Salad because DMC doesn't apply 1.5U Dendro and fuck over your Electro application. But Nahida is still, like, good in it, and Salad is just such a strong team that it's completely fine that she's slightly outclassed in it. And even then, right, if everything goes right, it wouldn't surprise me if you can make it work better than with DMC. But I like DMC's reliability more. Anyways, it's a good Nahida team nonetheless. But the fact that DMC is good as well is also pretty important because, like, yeah, not everyone has Nahida. And it's nice that she's not just better than DMC literally everywhere, that we still have places where the 1.5U Dendro actually fucks you over enough that DMC would still be fine. Salad is overall just very, very strong. It's very versatile. It is really good in AoE and in single target. I've been using it since Dendro came out. It's honestly been probably my best performing team overall when it comes to both AoE and single target included. There are teams that perform better in single target and there are teams that perform better in AoE, but I can't really think of a team that performs better in both. There are obviously going to be teams that, like, given specific AoE chambers, will perform better. But the fact that the Hyperbloom teams don't really rely on doing a full setup. Like, for example, in International, you gotta get your double swirl and then swap out of Kazuha, and then you can't really swap back into Kazuha until after you're done with your rotation, with your uptime. And so if there's multiple waves, that can kind of fuck you over. You don't have your swirls for the second wave. The Hyperbloom teams have such flexible rotations that you can kind of just do whatever the fuck and it'll still work. They're not too hard to play, although Nahida does make them a little bit harder. I mean, honestly, I'd say that, like, forcing a lot of Hyperbloom teams with Nahida today to make this video, and with DMC on the other side, I'm a lot less excited for Salad with Nahida than I was when I recorded the last video. I don't think it's definitely not bad, but it's definitely not, like, I don't think Nahida's the optimal Dendro unit to put in Salad, basically, most of the time. Even with her pretty large EM bonus that you gain from her burst, I'm not that big of a fan. They're still good, and they're still very, very playable. They're still very strong. But yeah, so that'll be it. Thank you for watching, YouTube, and I'll see you next time. Bye, YouTube.